Final Fantasy V is the second entry of the series to appear on the SNES console, and also the last entry to not have an initial release outside of Japan. It certainly has had its problems when coming over though, and as such means that a definitive version is extremely hard to find, since there isn't one really, unless you can read Japanese. The initial English port of the game is notoriously bad, with hilariously awful translations, and the bizarre decision to have one of the main characters speak pirate through the entire game. This would be the PS1 Anthology Collection edition of the game, which came bundled with Final Fantasy VI or 4 in the EU. However, before this came out, Final Fantasy V was amongst the first games to ever get a fan translation due to the outrage series fans had over the news of a lack of initial US release. This fan translation is still a popular option for people playing Final Fantasy V. However, due to the direct nature of the translation, I personally find it a little bit dry. Luckily, Square Enix re-released the game on the Game Boy Advance with a team that were evidently trying to emulate the same approach the famous translator Ted Woosley took with the Final Fantasy IV and VI translations. The result is a pretty fun script which isn't always technically 100% accurate, but certainly hits the tone the game clearly seems to convey. The final and most recent release is the Steam/mobile version of the game, which, honestly, the less said about it the better. At least it's got the GBA translation and the extra content. To try to get the best of both worlds, as I find the actual gameplay on the GBA to be inferior to the SNES version, I installed a mod to add the GBA translation into the SNES version. It isn't perfect, and there's the odd glitch with the text, but for me it's the best way to play the game. So I mentioned before about the tone of the game. Coming off Final Fantasy IV's self-seriousness, this entry is an amazing palate cleanser. Final Fantasy V is very goofy and silly, and I love it. The story has world-ending stakes by the end, yes, but the story mostly just feels like a light-hearted adventure. This is mostly achieved with the banter the group has with each other being light-hearted and jokey, which really makes journeying with them a joy to play out. In a way, the story here is basically a parody of similar JRPG stories of the era. I think that this is most evident in the main antagonist, Exdeath. He's a massive ham, and I think the biggest smoking gun regarding this being a sort of parody or critique is when the group finally catches up to him to confront him, claiming they'll stop his plans, only for Exdeath to turn around and throw back the question, well, do you even know what I plan to do? To which our hero, Bart, can only retort with well, I don't know, evil stuff? The fact that Gilgamesh originates here and he's a bumbling henchman of Exdeath who you confront many times, with a lot of his encounters being mostly jokes, I'd say the evidence is clear. Regarding story, let's start from the beginning. The setup here is rather standard for what we'd assume to be a Final Fantasy game at this point. Something wrong is going on with the crystals, and the crystals are linked to the nature of the world in some way. We start with the King of Tycoon leaving to investigate the Wind Crystal, with main character Lena asking her father why he has to go. Evidence of the wind dying surrounds the shattering of the crystal, punctuated by a meteor falling from the sky using the power of Mode 7 to demonstrate its fall. This stirs another main character and his chocobo to investigate. The main character here you can name anything you want, but the canonical name here is Bart, with a Z. He saves Lena from some goblins and discusses what they're going to do, not really planning on journeying together before they hear some groaning nearby, which turns out to be an old man who has hit his head from the meteor fall and has amnesia. It's interesting to note that it's not the main character with the amnesia, which is a trope within RPGs, but in this game is a problem the player's surrogate character doesn't have to deal with, which is an interesting little twist to be honest. In another twist, the other two characters don't initially travel with Bart and make their own way. They end up reuniting not long after though, but again, it's a little thing which makes the story just a touch more engaging to me. It's helped by the personalities of these characters, and the way they play off each other. The old man, Galuf, has fun with Bart in several ways. The first major one is pretending to be asleep while Bart talks to Lena, only to poke fun at his decision to join them as because he has the hots for her. It's all very charming. The last character joined is the pirate captain Faris, whose ship the trio tried to steal in order to get to the Wind Shrine. They are captured by Faris and crew, but Lena reveals she's a princess of Tycoon by showing her the pendant, which causes Faris to pause on throwing the group overboard to feed the fishes, eventually joining them on their quest. The pacing here is very breakneck. Within 30 minutes you know most of the characters and their personalities, they survive a landslide, attempt to steal a pirate ship, get captured but quickly released, and then up to the Wind Shrine for the reveal of the early game goal and acquire your first jobs. That's quite a lot of development in the first half an hour, and it barely lets up to be honest. You barely ever sit in one area and none of the dungeons outlast their welcome. Backstory is sprinkled in either through optional story segments which explain the reasons for Bart and Lena growing into the people they are, or in the main story explaining the role the Dawn Warriors played in the 30 years prior. I found these overall to be surprisingly compelling, with the Dawn Warriors being another crack at the Warriors of Darkness plot from Final Fantasy III, but much more successfully realised here. That's not to say the story is flawless though. Sure, it's very much a light-hearted romp and I thoroughly enjoyed it for that, but the actual plot itself is pretty simple. In a way it's the remake of Final Fantasy III, but done a lot better overall. However, comparing the story here to its direct predecessor leaves it wanting. There's little of the more heavy themes seen in Final Fantasy IV, the closest maybe being fighting for those that have passed. The group is mostly reunited by their common trait of having lost someone dear to them, often their parents, and upholding the promises made to them. One of my least favourite plot elements in the game involves Faris though, and while it's small, it's a part of the story that has aged the worst in my opinion. It involves Faris' secret that she's actually a woman, not a man as she's been masquerading as for the past hour of the game. On its own, it's not a bad plot beat and makes some sense. That being a pirate and revealing yourself to be a woman may not go down well, especially when all the pirates are horny men or something. Honestly though, I don't think the pirates Faris leads would care all that much regardless, but here we are. It's first shown when she is sleeping in an inn and Bart goes to stir her to get her moving, only to come back without Faris and love struck. Garrus follows afterwards and comes back pretty much the same. I think the implication here being that they saw her assets when they went to stir her. Faris, seemingly unaware, gets out of bed and tells them she'll catch up. The proper reveal is when later in the game, the group have to traverse through an underwater section of the ship graveyard, and they take a minute to dry their clothes. What makes this a bit unsettling is that both Bart and Gulluf rather forcibly try to encourage Faris to take her clothes off to dry, pretending to still think that she's a man, and that if she doesn't, she'll catch a cold. To me, I think it's a bit creepy, and while played for last, I don't think it was handled amazingly well. What with the two being way too eager to take them clothes off. It's a tiny part of the overall experience, about 5 minutes total of the 25 hours I put into the game, but it's still stuck with me like a tiny, painful splinter. And speaking of splinters, let's quickly discuss Exdeath as an antagonist. I said earlier that he's a bit of a hammy villain, possibly by design, and I stick by that. His story is that he's an evil tree. Yep. Well, that's being pretty reductive, but the evil tree was one that was used to house evil spirits within the Forest of Moor, and the evil spirits manifest the tree into the form that we now know as Exdeath. The name seems to imply that he is beyond death itself, his evil so malicious and pure. This certainly plays into his plans and also a part of the parody theory I was talking about earlier too. His goal is to return everything to the void, even himself. He seems to have no other desire than to simply destroy everything. The power he seeks isn't to rule over anything. He doesn't even ultimately care if he can even control the power, so long as it ends everything. His final form in the boss fight says, "I am Neo Exdeath. All memories, dimensions, existence, all that is shall be returned to nothing. Then I, too, can disappear. Forever!" The reason I see him as a form of parody is simply by how over-the-top evil he is. He's literally the physical embodiment of all evil given form through a tree. Certainly a parody of motiveless, cartoonishly evil villains from other JRPGs. Exdeath is also responsible for a death that actually hits pretty hard though. A lot more than most of the ones from Final Fantasy IV. Gulluf faces him down after his true potential starts to become awoken, and in a moment of self-sacrifice and love for his granddaughter, takes the hit in her place. He should be dead almost instantly, but the magic Exdeath uses, and his determination keeps him going as Gulluf beats him down into submission. This results in his death, and this isn't no fake out like we got in Final Fantasy IV. This hits pretty hard due to the rather upbeat nature of the story so far, so for something so dramatic and so irreversible to happen at the midpoint hits all the harder. His abilities are passed on to Cryle, but you and her both feel the loss of the moment. Good stuff. It's a bit of a shame Cryle's not much of an interesting character, especially compared to Gulluf. But, you know, that's just how it is sometimes. Outside of the few big moments though, the narrative here is pretty unfocused and meandering, ultimately not being the main focus or draw of this entry of the series. Instead it makes up for the shortcoming with stellar gameplay. The basic gameplay of Final Fantasy V is barely touched from the last game. The same battle system with the ATB and same overworld and dungeon exploration at a basic level. What isn't broke shouldn't be fixed, right? The big difference here though is the extremely robust job system. And boy oh boy, this game is an absolute treat to play. The basic concept is very much the same as Final Fantasy III, with each crystal bestowing new jobs to the group to mess around with. The difference here though is that you're free to choose another job for each character whenever out of combat, and with no penalty for doing so. No job points to spend which must be ground out, and no stat reducing swap sickness. You're completely free to experiment. This is fantastic as some bosses almost require you to experiment with your composition a little bit. There are certain bosses which are extremely tough, but they are extremely satisfying to beat once you figure out a setup which lets you roll through them. What also makes this job system great is that as you level up the jobs for each character, they earn an ability or trait which they can take over to other jobs. This opens up the opportunities for a very diverse team, and some almost broken combinations. A few examples of some combinations I came up with are Lena leveling up Ninja to max so she could dual wield as a Mystic Knight, meaning that she can imbue her weapons with a powerful magic spell and hit twice a turn. This was extremely useful in the later fights which required high damage output and weakness exploitation. Another example was I made Galuf/Kryla healer main, leveling White Mage to max, but also maxing out Time Mage too, so by the end of the game, Cryo could quickly add haste buffs to the party while also dishing out massive heals. Time Magic is great too, as there's a spell called Reset which literally puts you back to the start of the fight, great for tough fights that hit you with bad random chance outcomes at the start. My final example is Faris, who I made the magic powerhouse, maxing out Black Mage and Summons, both of which proved extremely helpful in the end game. The other great thing about leveling up the jobs is that each job mastered adds stats to the freelancer job, making it the most powerful class in the game if enough jobs are mastered. You're also free to choose any 2 learn traits or actions as opposed to just one, making them the most versatile too. They even inherit certain innate abilities too, such as Knight's cover ability, an extremely satisfying endgame reward to be sure. The dungeons are all pretty excellent. They're mostly pretty straightforward affairs, but with plenty of hidden treasures along the way. Often the rewards are worth a detour too. I think the finest example is the last dungeon, the Interdimensional Rift. For the most part, it's a very simple dungeon and a surprisingly brief one for a final dungeon, but if you don't do any of the optional areas or boss fights, you'd better have brought along plenty of restoration items, young man. The dungeon is relatively short but packed to the brim with mini bosses, which will churn through your resources to beat. Unless of course you slow down a bit and take on some of the optional stuff by exploring a little bit, as 2 optional bosses leave behind extra save points as well as being interesting encounters in their own right. Another great dungeon is the Library of the Ancients, which has a unique bookshelf moving mechanic to navigate around, as well as being filled to bursting with unique monsters that appear from books and are named after different numbered pages. Stuff like this really lends to the believability of this wacky world you're adventuring in. Boss fights are the bread and butter of a good RPG, and I feel Final Fantasy V delivers on this front. A lot of the boss fights are interesting mechanically speaking with some unique gimmicks. Bosses like the first proper fight with Exdeath require preparation and massive damage output, so adding haste, reflect, and a golem summon to stop physical attacks means that you can unleash hell upon him with impunity. In my case, unleashing some mage rage by turning everyone into black mages and spamming high level magic. Other bosses have different elemental weaknesses and can change their vulnerability, which means that you need to intuit by paying attention to what they're casting. The job system is fun to mess around with in these encounters, as some bosses can be manipulated in a variety of ways. With the use of blue magic, some bosses can be instantly killed with spells like level 5 death, and the level manipulated with other blue mage spells. I didn't personally make much use of these in this playthrough as they take a lot of work to learn, but the rewards are obviously very much worth the effort. Other bosses have AI that you can exploit. An example from late in the game is the fight with Catastrophe, who will always bring down anyone who's floating, so it can use ground-based attacks. So you can go through the fight without ever taking damage by just constantly casting float on your team, so it wastes turns. It's a little exploitative, but discovering this exploit is part of the fun in my opinion. So the last major element of any good Final Fantasy game is the music. Honestly, Final Fantasy V delivers on this front. Once again, Nobuo Uematsu has created a fantastic OST for this game. There's less of the more emotional tracks due to the nature of the tale here, but that doesn't stop him from creating some for the few heavier scenes. Some highlights for me are the Wind Shrine music, Lena's theme, the boss music, a track called Sorrows of Parting, a track called Reminiscence, another called The Day Will Come. One of the hypest tracks in all of Final Fantasy, Battle on Big Bridge. And of course, the final battle theme. That's a lot of music I've just highlighted, and I've only just scratched the surface on the vast amounts of music in this game. I think that's truly a testament to how great the OST is here, and it certainly helps keep the adventure going even when the story is a bit middling. This leads us to the ultimate question: where does this rank for me amongst the other games so far? Well, I'd certainly say it's better than the NES games, as this is basically a much better version of Final Fantasy III. The real conflict within my mind is how to rank it up against Final Fantasy IV. While the story isn't as complex as Final Fantasy IV, its simplicity, I think, actually helps it upon repeat playthroughs. The issue with Final Fantasy IV's story make playing through it a second time less impactful. The big story beats with heroes sacrificing are much less impactful when you know it will be reversed a few hours later. Which is a shame when the story is otherwise so great, especially for the time. The customization present within Final Fantasy V's job system makes the game an absolute joy to play, and makes new playthroughs feel fresh as you focus on different jobs. The difference between the two is obviously in their focus. Final Fantasy IV is way more focused on the storytelling, while Final Fantasy V is much more focused on the gameplay. Honestly, looking back at the two, I'll say Final Fantasy V actually succeeds more at the focus of the title. Not only does it absolutely achieve its goal of making the gameplay very engaging, but the storytelling is in some ways a lot better with more expressive character sprite animations. So yeah, the ranking so far are as follows from best to worst: 5, 4, 1, 3 and 2. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you when I'm back with Final Fantasy VI.